Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future with your host, Alan Pence. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do. Introducing your host, Alan Pence.
All right, welcome back to another episode of AI, Government and the Future. I'm your host, Max Romanik, and today I am joined by Tony Samp. Tony is the Principal Policy Advisor and Head of AI Policy at DLA Piper, with over 18 years of experience in government affairs. Named one of Washington Magazine's 500 most influential people in D.C., he has been instrumental in shaping AI policy and safety standards through his work with the Senate AI Caucus and the U.S. AI Safety Institute Consortium. Today, we'll explore the evolving landscape of AI policy in the U.S., discussing its implications on national security and ethical considerations. Tony will share his deep insights into these critical issues. Welcome to the podcast, Tony.
Thank you, Max. It's great to be here.
To get us kicked off here, with your extensive experience in government, could you start by sharing your perspective on how the intersection of AI and government policy has evolved over the past decade? And more specifically, what led to the formation of the Senate AI Caucus?
You know, we all know AI has been around for decades. But if you look back just one decade in Congress, you'd be hard-pressed to even find a mention in legislation or in committee hearings dedicated to the topic. It was not on the forefront of policymakers' minds. When I first started working on Capitol Hill, certainly there were areas within government that were focused on it. So the national laboratories, two in particular, I worked with Sandia National Laboratory, Los Alamos, even the Pentagon labs. They were working on it to some degree or another, but it wasn't something that policymakers were really grasping or understood the significance of it. So, but in 2017, that's when things kind of changed. That's when China announced its strategy for being the global innovation center for artificial intelligence by 2030. And around that same time, that's when Putin declared that whoever develops and leads in AI is going to rule the world. And it was comments like that really grabbed people's attention. And it was kind of a wake-up call for policymakers. So it was around that time, 2018, that members really started paying attention. And also around that time is when they established the National Security AI Commission. So that was included in a defense bill that usually gets signed into law every year. But this was a major endeavor because it set up a 12-person team that kind of really tackled a whole variety, almost a whole of government approach to AI. And that's one of the first big indicators of where Congress was starting to pay attention. So at that time, I was the senior advisor to Senator Martin Heinrich. He was a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He was a member of the Senate. So he's a member of Intelligence Committee, the Armed Services Committee. And so at that time, that was something we were paying very close attention to. What we also knew was that there was no formal AI working group, also known as a caucus in congressional speak. With that kind of absence of members and staff dedicated to that type of issue, that was something we filled. And so Senator Heinrich and Senator Portman were the two co-chairs. Heinrich is still the co-chair, but that was something that we kind of put together for two main purposes. One, to be a conduit to the commission between Congress and the National Security AI Commission, but also to really just help raise awareness among policymakers. So other senators, their staff, host meetings, briefings, author legislation. One of the things we did, we hosted Dr. Lynn Parker. She was the first ever chief AI czar, and that was in the Trump administration, but she's been terrific. So she came over, briefed us. It was things like that, really to help members get up to speed. But, it wasn't until 2022, and I'm just going to try to go through a timeline here for you, Max. I hope it's helpful. But that 2022-23, that was ChatGPT. So that's when the explosion of interest happened. So you had all these kind of over the years, but once that really came into place, you had congressional hearings, legislation, a whole bunch has happened since then. You're tracking this. Senator Schumer, so the majority leader, launched the AI Insight forums shortly after that. The whole fall was full of it. And then the roadmap. So, to answer your question, what's happened in a decade? A lot.
I love that we ended that with the Senate AI roadmap. My next question there really is can you outline some of the key legislative actions proposed and their intended outcome for our listeners? I think that's a great place to begin the rest of our discussion today.
Sure thing. So I think it's important to kind of understand what the purpose of the group. So that bipartisan AI working group, 4 members, kind of like a good bellwether of those who are bipartisan. They can seek compromise. They're willing to work together and find where folks can agree on, and then maybe prompt some ideas for legislation. So that was kind of the intent, to do all of these forums, academics, industry, to come to Washington, D.C. and help accelerate the process of folks understanding what all is happening. And so within the roadmap, there were a few things that are notable, right? So within innovation, which is something that, this Congress in the United States, and generally speaking, is something they prioritize. They first want to see, how can we help encourage, more innovation? How can we continue to lead in these areas? So if you have $32 billion full of that's what the recommended amount of investment that those 4 senators put forward. And why do you get to that number? Well, that was one of the things that the AI Commission suggested years back that we already kind of talked about. So that number is something that they endorsed. It's non-defense. That's an important distinction. There's already a lot of money being put in AI from the Department of Defense, from the intelligence community. But in terms of non-defense, that's where that increase is being recommended. And it's also important to know that within the U.S., it's private industry that's the real driver of research. It's not the U.S. government, right? The big tech companies are investing hundreds of billions of dollars of their own money into research. Okay, so what role does the U.S. government have to play? They fill those gaps, right? They find the areas in basic and applied research with universities, dish out grants, right? And you try to find the diamonds in the rough, where the things that maybe industry isn't prioritizing, but that's kind of the intent there. So that recommendation of the $32 billion, I'd say that's a big portion of it. That would also go towards infrastructure, NIST kind of facilities, as you and your listeners probably are familiar with. NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, it continues to get asked to do a whole lot. The executive order put so much on their plate, and they're sitting here. They've tackled some of the biggest problems in the past. So if you look at Wi-Fi or encryption, cybersecurity, right? They were at the forefront of developing the standards that eventually became the norm globally. And if you're from private industry standpoint, that's important. You help set in place that. It is kind of happening here with artificial intelligence. So policymakers in Congress and the executive branch understand the importance of what NIST is doing. And so that's some of the big things that the roadmap emphasized.
That $32 billion recommended investment, comparative globally, how on par are we with the rest of the global community? Is that a higher investment, a lower investment? Like, where does the United States sit with that sort of recommendation?
Again, I like to point to more of what the private sector does, because it's a little apples and oranges. Now, if you compare it to China, yes, they invest tens of billions annually in AI. It's at the local municipality level, and that's also kind of one of the things that got folks' attention back in that 2017-18 timeframe. Is there kept being reports and articles, think tanks writing about this, about how they are mobilizing, and they have the money to do it more from a state-run approach. That's not how we do things in the United States, and it's more private sector based. So, yeah, comparatively, that number's fairly small. But when you think about the areas and where it's targeted, that's where it makes the most impact.
Sure. And of those sectors that you mentioned, innovation, infrastructure, all that sort of stuff, where do you think there's going to be the most pushback? What's going to be the hardest stuff to get Congress aligned around?
So the ones that always seem to provide difficulty is copyright, IP, these considerations, right? It's been decades since the last real overhaul. Remain a tricky spot. I think the roadmap, you see it kind of touch on it, but not a whole lot. Also within kind of the explainability and the black box nature of AI systems. I thought it was a real interesting part of the roadmap where bipartisan members, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, acknowledge that. And they say it's kind of difficult for any regulatory agency to enforce if you're not able to determine what went into the decision-making process. And so there is a nod in there to how can you start to shed a little more light, a little more transparency into whether it's the training data or the factors that were in the decision-making process. So I think that'll be also a tricky area, but it's something that they did acknowledge and members want to see a little more attention to. Yeah, so the roadmap, although we view it as regulatory in nature, I think it's easy to interpret it kind of as that. There's not a whole lot of hard regulation or there's not legislative language. That's for one thing to just for your listeners. It's more of a roadmap and guidance of how to legislate and what considerations to make. Okay, so how do you balance it all? Right, I think what we've talked about NIST a little bit, but that is kind of their sweet spot. And the risk management framework that they authored over a multi-year process, stakeholder engagement, that risk management framework is kind of considered the gold standard for how organizations are supposed to use AI, or the considerations that they should be having when they think about adopting AI. Within that context, I think that's how it's all balanced. So when you have an entity like NIST driving those considerations, asking those tough questions, and then also leading the research, right? So the AI Safety Institute, some of the things, right, the red teaming, synthetic content, they're all looking into ways where they can understand that better, and then you can maybe inform decisions about regulation.
I know that DLA Piper has a lot of involvement with the Safety Institute as one of its founding members. Can you talk a little bit about the role that your firm is looking to play in shaping some of those safety standards?
Yeah, it's an exciting forum to be a part of. I think DLA Piper is one of the only law firms that are part of it. And one of the big reasons, right, or why it makes sense is because we have a data analytics team. And so the law firm is kind of unique in that manner. You have one way of describing it could be kind of a 3-legged stool. So DLA Piper's AI data analytics practice. On one leg, you may have the policy function, the one that I head up. So from emerging regulation, emerging legislation, tracking those developments. And then 2, from an AI governance standpoint. So you have attorneys to help entities build out what considerations they should be making for their own AI strategy, internally what they need to be thinking about. And then 3rd, when you have the data scientists who are able to do red teaming and the kinds of things that these businesses or organizations need to be thinking about, that's where it all comes together. So it's within these different working groups, those data analytics, those analysts are able to kind of weigh in and provide their inputs and add value in ways that you probably wouldn't think a law firm would be able to do.
Yeah, it's very forward thinking for sure. Within that group, have you noticed any sort of significant hurdles that they've run into in terms of scaling up their recommendations?
So, I think it would be premature to really comment on what is being looked at and what's being found. I do know and would be able to say that, of the priority areas, right, they're looking at different buckets, right? So if you're thinking about synthetic content today, like look at the elections in India. Boy, deep fakes were all over the place. from audio to video. It's all these different things playing out. We're seeing it here in the United States. Every country is going to see a proliferation of these types of media that are so easy to create. And so how do you detect it? How do you authenticate it? Like, all of these considerations are things that are very technical. And that's what makes sense from where NIST is playing a role here. They're taking some of the best and brightest minds in each of these different areas within industry, within academia, and civil society to try to inform those decisions, develop those standards, and then react to them. So that's just like an example, I would think, of the things that they're focused on. And at the end of the day here, producing a report with recommendations on how folks should think about it.
Sure. And, definitely it seems like the sort of balancing act that has to happen between really wanting to spur innovation and keep pushing out the bleeding edge with these capabilities. But then at the same time, what sort of capabilities are we creating? How are they going to be used? And sort of what sort of actions need to be taken to curtail misuse of those things? Because these incredibly powerful capabilities, and the opportunity for misuse is great.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big fears or concerns, right? I think one of the forums, the AI Insight forums in the Senate, one of them was doomsday scenarios. And, you could go a lot of different directions under that topic. But, one of the areas of focus was the proliferation of deep fakes. And so, boy, an erosion of trust in everything we see and hear. And online, and this video right here, right? In time, you could duplicate this. You could make each other say different things, and boy, hopefully that doesn't happen here. But I think it's just an example, right, of everything we're listening, everything we're seeing. It's being taken very seriously, and so how do you legislate on that? And Congress is trying to grapple with that, of whether it's a watermarking and disclosure type requirement behind these, whether it's a campaign ad or a robocall. We saw the Biden robocall in New Hampshire. That was created. You only need, I think, like 3 seconds of somebody's voice with all these text-to-speech engines, voice cloning. And just think about how easy that is. And that's going to create a problem for commerce, for just basic dialogue between individuals and interaction. So you're spot on, and that's something that I think folks are really.
Yeah, and it's really edifying to hear that Congress is taking that on so directly. We spend a good bit of time on this podcast trying to help our listeners untangle what is myth and what is reality in terms of AI. You hear a lot of sort of fear-mongering around, this is going to be Terminator with Skynet and all that sort of stuff. Sometimes the scarier version is actually the non-sentient but ultra-intelligent algorithm that is just a better data processor. Sometimes the use cases there are a lot scarier than the machines rising up against us and starting a revolution. So I really appreciate the efforts at trying to tie it to reality and make sure that if we're actually going to be looking at these things from a regulatory perspective, a policy perspective, we're attacking real things, not the fears of what this might turn into in the future. Looking out ahead in terms of AI governance over the next, say, decade or so, what sort of things do you foresee as being really critical steps as we try to explore the prospects of coming up with a proper governance structure for AI?
So there's a couple things that I've been paying close attention to, and I think that are only going to rise in the level of attention from Congress. And energy is one of them, right? So the demands on the energy grid, because of the amount of compute required to run and train these large language models. So as more of those are developed, big tech understands this. That's why they're investing tens of billions of dollars into helping provide an energy capacity that they can help fuel these runs. So it's how do we grapple with that? How does globally? So if China's also developing LLMs, and if Russia, if our allies are doing the same, the demands on the electrical grid are just going to get heavier and heavier. And so I think that is something to pay close attention to. I think there was a hearing either today or yesterday in the House Energy and Commerce that started to to look at this. Those are going to happen more and more. I also think I touched on this earlier, but the black box nature, again, it's just an area that no one has a real good answer for. It's going to take a lot of research and a lot of focus to try to come up with a way where consumers and industry are comfortable with knowing that whatever decision and algorithm or the AI system that they're working with, whatever the decision that was made, that they're comfortable with it. So I think understanding that better, finding ways to show transparency is something that policymakers will focus on. It'll just take a lot of time, a lot of effort.
What sort of things have you seen being introduced as ways to combat the black box nature of it?
Yeah, good question. Not a whole lot, to be honest, right? Because what are the technical solutions here? And so that's where it's the grants, the fundings to universities, where they start to peel back the onion, hone their focus and their research towards really specific areas. You kind of trustworthy AI, and you can create that, elements of that a little better. And so I think it's from a funding perspective where that is where government, National Science Foundation will start to play a role.
And have you seen anything, like human in the loop obviously is one of the ones that gets bandied about a lot, but there's going to be plenty of applications where that could be very difficult or borderline impossible to do so. Other things that we've seen come up as well would be like mandatory disclosures, almost like a financial regulatory thing where it's like, hey, you got to tell us the good and the bad about how all this stuff works. And we all have to be able to be operating with the same sort of egalitarian approach to the information. Anything like that coming up as a potential idea?
Yeah. So, some talk about, okay, what from a regulatory agency, who would be best to enforce something like this or demand? It's been floated around, right? You see the FTC considered in certain things. You see NTIA. So where do the developers and the deployers provide transparency reports or impact assessments? Well, within, that's all to be determined here. But those are the ideas being kicked around. And then, okay, so you've seen the self-certification bill in the Senate Commerce that Klobuchar, Thune, there were 6, right? 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans on there. That's one of the things to help kind of shed a little light behind decision-making process. So I think that's an example of that. But if you're talking about what the technology solution, and that's when I was there's not a whole lot there on that. That's what's there's an absence behind how do you actually provide that? And is there a way to embed it and make it seamless? I think that'll take a lot of time, and a lot of smart people.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it's headed that direction. I'd love to switch gears here just a little bit and talk about some specific sector applications of AI, sort of starting with the big ones. How do you see AI transforming America's defense capabilities currently?
The Pentagon spends a whole lot of money on both buying systems, but also in research and development. So within the intelligence community as well, they have organizations that are starting to look at acquisition and procurement a little differently. And that's been a nice change. That's all kind of happened in the last 10 years. If we're talking about what's happened in the last decade, right? So the Defense Innovation Unit, these kind of groups that are more embedded with Silicon Valley to help pull ideas, traverse the valley of death, get them into the hands of the warfighters. Those things are actually starting to happen. They're building congressional support. There's a lot of frustration in Congress about how slow the acquisition process is. It takes many, many years to really establish a program of record. And when you were used to be acquiring ships and tanks and planes, and that was the only thing you weren't procuring software. It was the system in place today made sense, but not a whole lot. So when you think about how much the industry is investing on their own, we talked about that as well. That's another reason why the Pentagon should be embracing that. And so non-traditional vendors, other than the big prime defense contractors that folks that are more familiar with, you're starting to see them win contracts, get work, deploy their systems and prove their value. And that's happening. So within AI, what's the most transformative element for the Pentagon and the IC? That could be, in my opinion, would be how you process data. And so when you have the amount of information coming in on a daily basis, so whether that's satellite imagery, video feeds, or open source information, usually it would take thousands of analysts to comb through that data, to make sense of it, and actually recommend an action. Now, AI can do that. It doesn't say that this is the answer, but it sure narrows it down where it can inform the human analysts. To your point about having a human in the loop, right? It's so important. And the Pentagon's thinking about it like this too, right? So if they have their own ethical pillars, and you can look that up. Google DoD, I think, responsible AI, and they have a whole document. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to AI blueprint, traceability, accuracy, having humans play a role in the process. And so, like, there's some overlap in that way. But I guess the point is, in that particular function, I would think that could make the biggest impact within data processing. And you could even look at it in different ways in more benign applications like predictive maintenance for these old antiquated systems, or even the next generation, fifth generation aircraft, all of them. Okay, how do you anticipate failure or erosion of parts? And you can order that ahead of time. And these are the kind of ways where you find efficiencies. Policymakers are excited about that because that's a way where you can get some savings.
Sure. And certainly you're never going to have any difficulty finding support for those programs that are all about getting rid of waste, fraud, abuse, being more efficient, pre-placement of assets, all that sort of stuff. I think that where our listeners tend to put their thumb on the scale is on the ethical considerations around some of the more controversial things like lethal autonomous weapons systems and things like that. Are the ethics of a lethal autonomous weapons system coming up in these discussions, or is that still seen as a little bit of a future capability where we need the rest of the sector to catch up a little bit before we get there?
So there are a lot of better minds on that specific topic than me. And Paul Scharr over at the Center for New American Security is one that comes to mind. Bob Work, Deputy Secretary of Defense, ones that have really focused on that part of it. What I would say is I would point to the document that I mentioned, because if you look through that, you see where, I think they had a DoD AI ethicist or a actual full-time position that was dedicated to that and that alone, and worked with the team to one, help build that report, but also for the military services when they think about adopting AI and using it within their decision-making process. Certain considerations that need to be made. I think when you're talking about human in the loop, there are certain weapon systems that counter drone or counter missile. Like in those regards, it's a defensive in nature. It's happening at a pace and speed where time is of the essence. If you don't act and don't take the shot to intercept, then there can be major casualties or consequences. So I think in that there's a different criteria for that versus when, okay, you're looking at a target that may be a human being, and those are the highly consequential where those additional considerations, the law of war and things like that take place. So again, I don't want to dive into too deep into that.
Sure. No, I totally appreciate that. Shifting away a little bit from defense, I'd love to talk a little bit about the impact of AI on sectors like healthcare and life sciences. What sort of transformations do you think would be reasonable to anticipate based on the Senate's roadmap for fields like that?
So life sciences, bio, healthcare, tremendous potential. Now, the roadmap didn't talk about it a whole lot. There was a section, yes, dedicated to it, but in terms of actual policy recommendations, substantive ones, you're not going to see a whole bunch. And that's not because they don't care, nor do they see the value in it. It's just, I think it's it's a good opportunity to talk about, the different approaches and how you regulate AI, right? There's some discussion from folks about you create an entire new entity, a new agency to regulate AI. And then there's others that are, well, it's probably better suited to be more sectoral and focused on where agencies specialize. Well, within healthcare, you kind of have a good barometer here because FDA got their own internal processes. They've approved, I think, over 800 medical devices to be used for AI purposes. And so you have a whole team of folks who are tracking this issue closely. Do you need to reinvent the wheel there? Maybe not, right? So I think from a healthcare perspective, life sciences, there is enormous potential in drug discovery, in diagnostics, and policymakers understand that. But it's okay, what more do you need to do from a legislative standpoint? There may not be a whole lot. I think within the healthcare industry, they would appreciate more predictability in the AI governance and the structures there, but that's going to have to work out directly with them from a reimbursement standpoint, from all these different just areas that, within CMS, Medicare, Medicaid. I think those are interesting areas to examine a little more closely. And, the executive order does touch on that. You might be tracking the task force within HHS that is, I think they have 365 days. It's another one of these rolling deadlines, but they're working on that right now. So as we speak, trying to find out where are the things we need to pay most attention to, and then issue rules or comment periods and try to make more sense of the kind of areas that make the most sense.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I definitely think there's some wisdom to what you're saying around letting the agencies that already have a sector specialization add a capability rather than create an entire new entity. I mean, HHS is pretty pro at enforcing HIPAA privacy violations. Let them use that function that they already have a pretty wired system around, and just create an instance of, okay, so now an AI flavor is a different category of privacy violation, but it's still within the general ballpark of privacy violations that we've been enforcing now for decades.
100%. And HIPAA, to modernize that a little bit or take a look at it, and with the advent of AI and how it's being used, are there tweaks that need to be made, but not an overhaul? So there's a lot of opportunity there. And within that task force, they're starting to roll out some of these actions. I would anticipate that in the coming months here.
That makes sense. Last sort of general big sector questions I had for you are all about workforce development. With the advances of AI, obviously, jobs are going to go away, but then new jobs are going to get created that have never existed before. What sort of challenges have you seen for that? And can you talk about any initiatives that the Senate or Congress in general have for displacement and retraining programs for people whose jobs might be threatened by the developments of AI?
Happy to. And Max, it's a great question because it is one of the fears amongst so many policymakers. And the happened many years back, right? So when you think about AI and what it's going to do, it was always, first and foremost, usually was, is it going to take my job? And I would say that is not as big of a focus as it once was, because as folks have gotten more educated and aware of the potential of AI, they see the positives and the opportunities. So it's less of a focus, but it's still on people's minds. And what do you do about it, right? So you can't really stop this tidal wave of change, this transformative technology, just like like electricity or the advent of the internet. You're going to have to adjust for it. So the things that we're seeing, that the roadmap, the bipartisan working group suggested, are these kind of things that are proactive ways to incentivize scholarships, to fund retraining. We've already seen legislation authored by the chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, so Cantwell and Senator Moran from Kansas. So you get a cross-section of the company. You got Washington State, you have Kansas, rural areas, right? So how does everybody adapt and change and what's to come? So it starts from the very beginning of education, pre-K, K through 12. It's kind of funny to look at the ideas when it's talked about this. I have a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. So, okay, how are you going to teach AI in the classrooms at young ages. And how are they going to do that? Well, they have to build the curriculum. And that's part of why the government leads in this area. And so part of the ideas that have been floated are, okay, National Science Foundation, let's give you more funding and direct you to dedicate it towards these purposes. Start building out the curriculum. Do grand prize challenges where you encourage Americans, professors to come up with the best way of doing this. It'll inspire folks, and it'll also prepare them for the jobs that are to come. So I do view that as something that I get optimistic about, and it's an area that Congress is, I think, that you could see action on.
Yeah, I share your optimism there. It's an exciting time. I have my concerns around, the sort of mid-career people who suddenly are in need of job retraining. I think Singapore recently created a program for folks over 40 whose jobs have been eaten by AI to go back to college and get retrained in something else. Interesting to see where that stuff goes. But then to your point, how do you build AI into the classroom of the future and get people comfortable with it being there? And it definitely seems like it's a slightly different approach to education because, one man's plagiarism here is another man's efficiency.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the middle-aged, those who may be impacted, lose their jobs. So other parts that they focused on that I didn't quite mention were vocational training, right? So it's these like technical schools, empower them, fund those, provides outlets that cover maybe those ones that would be concerned about not having an easy adjustment. And sure, it won't be easy, right? But at least there's an area where they can go and try to maybe shift a little bit and then maybe make a lot of money, right? In some of these career fields, within AI or tech as a whole, coding and all these, you do really well. So there's interesting opportunities that might be coming.
As a means of wrapping up our conversation here, a lot of our listeners are government leaders and policymakers. And so I love to ask people in your position, what advice would you have for the government leader, for the policymaker who is either being facing down the barrel of needing to come up with some regulatory policy around AI, or they're considering integrating AI into their daily operations? What sort of things should they really be looking at closely?
So I think there's kind of two ways of approaching this. If you're thinking about policymakers, so I'll maybe first focus on them. So within Congress, right? Okay, should they be considering AI and how to use it? And I think it's at the end of the day, policymakers were the ones elected to office, not AI. And so having a human in the loop, meaning your staff or the member themselves, the member elected to Congress, always reviewing what they used AI to generate. So sure, it's great to be used for first drafts of either research or your talking points, your press releases, your legislation. AI can do wonders and be very helpful in that regard. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure it's factual. You need to make sure it makes sense. And it's in your own voice. Retail politics is still very important. And authenticity, looking people in the eyes, shaking their hands, like that is where you're really going to resonate with folks. So you'll do it more than any sort of chatbot or a robocall that infuriates people more than anything. So I get them all the time. I'm sure you do. It's not fun. It's not effective. So I would just kind of emphasize that. And then from an executive branch standpoint, it is excellent to see the leadership of both from an executive order in finding the niche areas that every executive agency has within AI, right? That's important, right? It's, okay, where want to avoid redundancies or duplicative efforts. So you find and you task those, maybe the Department of Homeland Security, if you're talking about bio and chemologic or biochem weapons or the potential for those kind of disastrous impacts. Well, they're the ones that specialize in it, or the national laboratories do. Empower them, assign them to start thinking about this critically and coming up with a plan. That's all important. It wasn't necessarily regulation per se within the executive order, but rather let's get serious on this technology and come up with a plan.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for an awesome conversation. I'm sure our listeners will be able to extract a lot of value out of this. Thank you so much for your time. And to the rest of our listeners, we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.